My name is Liana, Advocacy Director at the EU-ASEAN Business Council, and it's my pleasure to be your moderator for today. Now, super exciting time in Europe. Now that the elections are over and the results are in, I myself have been in Europe the past month, and it's been really interesting to see all the campaigning and also to hear locals sort of chatter about the elections. Now, it's clear now that there is a shift in the power balance in the European Parliament, but not the sort of dramatic shift to the right that polls sort of have predicted. It's a bit more of a nuanced picture, with the traditional coalition of the center right, EPP, the center left Socialists and Democrats, and the liberal Renew Europe group still commanding a sort of majority. But that said, the greater presence of right wing groups have given the right, essentially more clout in the EU's legislative process. But you're not here to hear from me. So I'm joined today by the real experts, Antoine Ripoll, Minister Councillor, Parliamentary Relations, the EU delegation to ASEAN. We have Olaf Winzek, Director at the CAS, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Multinational Development Policy Dialogue, as well as Agnes Ortolani, Principal Economist at the Economist Intelligence Unit. Now, we were supposed to have Lars Bohm. He's the head of Economic Policies Unit at the European Parliamentary Research Service. Here today as well, but I understand that he has a bit of an emergency to attend, and we wish him all the very best. Now, so over the next hour or so, we will unpack what the election results will mean for EU politics, the future of its policies, particularly the Green Deal and its outlook on international trade and relations, especially with ASEAN. We'll also discuss, its potential economic implications of the elections and what all these will mean for businesses. I know we'll try and end it for an hour and 15 minutes so that we can let you go on a Friday evening in Asia. So I would also like to invite all of you who've tuned in today. If you have any questions at all, please put them in the chat box or the Q&A. So let's just get down to it. Thank you, panelists, for joining us today. Maybe Olaf, I'd like to start with you. You've been watching the elections very, very closely. What's your take on it? What are the sort of major shifts, in voter behavior, especially the support for far-right parties? And, in a world where conservatives are gaining ground, should we be concerned about what's happening in the EU?
So thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm very honored to be here, and thanks to everyone who has joined, because for you it's Friday evening. So I particularly appreciate this. I mean, if you would do that in Brussels on Friday evening, I think people would be slightly irritated that they are invited to have a briefing on Friday evening. So I very much appreciate the presence of everyone is here, and I would I would like to thank very much the EU-ASEAN Business Council as well for the very kind invitation. Now, in order not to completely confuse you, I will first try to share my screen to have a look at very briefly at the actual results. So I hope you can see this.
All good. Thanks, Olaf.
Voila. So before you're completely confused, maybe a very brief explanation. What you see here is the composition of the European Parliament according to the confirmed affiliations in this new parliament. What does this mean? The European Parliament has 720 seats. The elections, that's very important to know, they take more or less place simultaneously. I mean, in some cases it was 1 or 2 days ahead than in other countries, but these are it's a accumulation of 27 European parliamentary national sub-elections. So you don't have one big election. So for example, if I'm as a Belgian national living in Belgium, I cannot vote for a German, usually for a German list, for example. So that's very important to know. That's the very first thing. The second thing, if we look at the global picture, you see a lot of colors, which is not surprising because the outgoing parliament had 7 different parliamentary groups that I'll very briefly explain. So on the far left, so deeply red, you had the far left group, which is basically either very far left socialists or sometimes communists. Then you had the slightly lighter red group, that's the S&D group, which are socialists and social democrats, which is a pro-European, pro-EU integration group. Then you had the Greens, which are also part of the, let's say, pro-European consensus in the European Parliament. You have the Liberals including the party of Macron, which are called Renew, that are also very much pro-European, and you have the EPP, which is the European People's Party, which is a center-right political group, which consists of Christian Democrats, conservatives, liberal conservatives, and centrists. Then you have the dark blue group that you see here, the ECR, which is quite a mixed bag, if I may say so. It consists of some slightly Eurosceptic, liberal conservative, some rather hard-tooth national conservatives, and a bunch of parties which can be called outright right-wing populists, anti-European right-wing populists. And then you have the even more far-right ID group, which are the black ones, that is composed of very strongly far-right parties. And this is also important. You see two other groups here. You see still, I think, around 83 parliamentarians in the European Parliament right now that are not yet affiliated, so who haven't yet joined a group. So this is the overall picture. Now, what are the results? The clear winner of the European elections for the 6th time in a row, by the way, has been the European People's Party, so the center and center-right group, clearly ahead, more than 50 seats ahead of the Socialists and Social Democrats. Then you have a close race for the 3rd place between this moderately Eurosceptic or kind of mixed bag group which is to the right to the EPP and the Liberals, and then followed by the very far right, the Greens, and the far left. If you look at this picture, so the EPP is the clear winner of the elections. Who else has won seats? For now, it's the one group to the right of the EPP, ECR, which on some issues is constructive, on some issues is not constructive in the next European Parliament. What do you see at the left side of the EPP? You see that the so-called progressive coalition, or the progressive parties, meaning the Socialists and Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Liberals, have all lost to different extents in this election. What is still important, very important to outline, is that you still have a strong pro-European coalition in the European Parliament. So you have around 64–65% of the MEPs who are very clearly there to work, to be constructive, and this is a clear majority which keeps the EU capable to act. That's something very important. Yes, there has been a move, as you see from the seats here, to a shift to the right of the EPP, but the pro-European kind of the big pro-European groups still hold. So the EPP, the Socialists and Social Democrats, and the Liberals will be still part of the key, still form the key group for consensus in the next European Parliament. And this is something very important. You see very different results in the respective member states. I will not go into details on that. So I think in about 14 countries, the parties right to the EPP, meaning on the far right, on the Eurosceptic moderate national conservative right, have actually gained seats in more or less half of the member states. But on the other half, they either remained as they were or they even lost seats. So it's a very differentiated result, but it's right. There is a shift to the right in European Parliament. It's not an earthquake. That's very important to underline. There is still a strong pro-European majority to work with. But, and this is important, inside these pro-European these pro-European groups, meaning the EPP, the Greens, the Liberals, and the Socialists, the kind of center of gravity has moved more to the center right. And this is important, I think, for a number of policy fields, but that we're going to talk about later. Now, you said, is it worrying that conservatives have gained ground? No, it's not as such, because the EPP they are conservatives, but they are strongly pro-European ones. So that is not the problem. The gains on that side of the spectrum can be a problem, but still there is a large pro-European and constructive majority in the European Parliament. And on this group, the ECR, we will actually have to see how they position themselves. This is still a bit open, how constructive they may be on some topics or not.
Yeah, thanks for that, Olaf. I mean, that's super. Sorry, Antoine, did you want to chime in?
Well, I think Olaf says a lot of things. I would like just to take a step back and maybe put things in a context where our or the listeners, the participants to this webinar who are not experts and should not be experts on European Parliament should understand what it means for them and for the relationship with the Southeast Asia and the rest of the world. So basically, as Olaf said, what happened? Was the first. This was the 10th time. The 10th time that the European Parliament was directly elected by the Europeans, and never before, I believe, I have witnessed 7 of these elections in my career at the Parliament. Never before have we seen such an interest, a political interest, not only in Europe but in the world, on this election and what they mean. Why? That's because these elections take place in a moment when many people are worried in Europe. Many people are worried for the future of their children, for the future of our societies, and it happens in a moment where there is a lot of geostrategic uncertainties. So the mood in Europe, but also beyond Europe, is a mood of worriness, and that's why these elections were followed very much. The second thing is that we have seen a rather important level of turnout. You will tell me that, for example, compared to the Indonesian elections, where they had some 85% of turnout, ours 51% was not fantastic. But compared to what we had before, we've maintained a rather high turnout. So even with that, it's important to know that many people voted, because that means that the vote that was expressed counts even more. So it's the more people vote, the more relevant the vote is. So basically, as Olaf said, what people have to understand is what happened, what changed, and what remains. What changed really is that we've seen a rise of the extremes, not as much as people thought it would be, but still we have seen a rise of the extremes, especially on the right, not only, also on the left to a certain extent. So people who what does it mean to the right? It means that basically people who are not in favor of the current level and the topics of integration, of EU integration, those people won some points. That's very clear. So we now have a parliament, as Olaf said, with a pro-European majority that is still strong, but that still will enable us to work as Europeans and to develop further the EU integration process. But the margin of maneuver will be more limited. So that's one thing. And then what people have to understand is that normally in your normal national parliament, the right doesn't work with the left. That's normally what happens in any country, right? Unless you have a coalition like in Germany or in other places, but usually it's not the case. In the parliament, because Olaf mentioned the 7 political groups. Actually, we have, yes, it's true, but we have 200 political parties. Imagine I can defy any country to work functionally with 200 national political parties. And yet we function because the center right and center left, so the center right, center left, liberals, and largely the Greens, decided maybe 15 years ago that what is the most important is not their proper ideological principles. Of course, they are important, but what is really important is to find a majority at the parliament together with the member state to take decisions. And we can see now that this election, and that is what remains, this election keeps this majority a bit weaker, but it keeps the majority. So I said what changes a bit more extremes. What remains is the fact that we have a pro-European coalition. What may change, and I will stop there, is that we may see some shifts in the priority, the political agenda of this next commission and of this next parliament. The mandate that is now finishing next month has been dominated by the green agenda. And this has an impact not only in Europe, but also in ASEAN and many other parts of the world. The question is to be seen whether this topic will remain front and center of the next mandate. I am myself not so sure. Of course, we will continue to implement our legislation because we have not changed the idea. We still want to protect the planet as much as we can and favor innovation at the same time. But I believe that with this new composition of the parliament, what it will mean for the agenda, the economic agenda, the trade agenda, is that maybe to a certain extent, growth and competitiveness and jobs will dominate the agenda together with the Greens, or we'll try to combine more the two aspects. And defense and security has become a big topic, which is a new thing led by the war in Ukraine, uncertainties in everywhere in the world, including with the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait tensions. So I believe that the result of all this for our participants and our readers, the people who are listening to us, who will talk to us, is what does it change for the policy? And I believe for the policy, what may change is growth and jobs will become the driver of the next mandate and the commission, we will see. And defense and security will be a bigger and bigger topic for us all. Thank you.
Thanks, Antoine. Yeah, I know I was going to get to that question, but you've addressed it. But I would like to maybe go to Olaf and maybe after that Agnes as well. Olaf, you unmuted yourself just a bit earlier. Would you like to weigh in a little bit on the priority agendas? Do you agree with Antoine? And maybe we can talk a little bit more about the priorities of the EU in terms of climate change. I think I've read online, a lot of worries, like, for example, coalition building for specific policy areas like climate change. EPP, for example, has signaled, the possibility of working with the far right on some issues. I don't know if I'm right, but what does this new makeup of the parliament mean for the priority agendas for the EU moving forward?
Well, first of all, I think there is something important to understand. You don't have a strict coalition in the European Parliament as you would have in national parliaments. So even if there is an agreement, as there usually is, between some of the pro-European groups, usually it used to be in the beginning only the EPP and the Socialists because they have enough votes, then also the Liberals were always kind of part of the consensus. Now they needed also the Greens, which was a bit more difficult for a number of reasons. But even if you have kind of a broad agreement about things, you still have issues where votes go the other way. So actually, on a number of issues, when it comes particularly to the climate agenda, not very many, that's important. The EPP usually supported the Green Deal, but on a few decisions, they were not in agreement with the Socialists, the Greens, and the Liberals. Only part of the EPP group joined them, which was kind of enough to just by sometimes very slim margin of around 10 votes, which is quite unusual in the European Parliament. It happens, but rather unusual in the European Parliament. They passed a number of legislations which were not supported by the majority of the EPP. Now, with those losses, I mean, if you see who lost votes particularly, and these numbers might still change. That's also important because those who are unaffiliated, they have no interest whatsoever to remain unaffiliated. So quite a number of them will try to join political groups because if you're among the unaffiliated, you're not mute, but you're basically blind and deaf in the European Parliament. So even if those numbers change a bit, still the Liberals will have lost, the Greens will have lost, the Socialists will have lost a bit, which means a number of decisions that in the last parliament got through by a very slim margin, and a number of them were linked to the Green Deal, will not pass through anymore, or would not have a chance in this parliament. And if you look at the discourse, and Antoine mentioned it, the discourse also ahead of the elections has already been much more competitiveness, security and defense, partly migration, yes, particularly from the Greens and from the Socialists, also the Green Deal. But I think we will have a certain realignment of priorities in this new parliament. Will it be a complete change? No, it will be a gradual adaptation, I believe. So will the Green Deal be completely kind of pushed back into the bin? Absolutely not. Because even if you might not need the Greens, and I think on some issues you will still need them, the Socialists have said already that for them, they don't want to go back on the Green Deal. I think not all of them think this way, but most will stick to that commitment. And even the Liberals and the EPP, they don't want to kind of put the Green Deal in the dustbin, but it's rather a question, where do we adapt it? Because maybe, I mean, deforestation is maybe one example, some others, the electric vehicles issue, we kind of went over the, we kind of exaggerated a bit. So what I would expect is that, yes, the Green Deal will continue, but it will be more adapted, I think, under consideration of what does this mean for our competitiveness. And I hope, I sincerely hope, and I have some signals sometimes for that they will also consider what will this actually mean, new proposals for our, sorry for this word creation, partnerability in the world. What does it mean for our ability to not kind of alienate partners, such as in Southeast Asia, with whom we actually want to work closer together? I think many in the European Parliament underestimated the effect of some of the legislative proposals that irked a number of the states where I think part the public is probably from. Yes, there will be a readaptation. I think there will be a realignment of priorities, but there will be no kind of, I mean, the Green Deal will not be buried. Some issues may be adapted. On other issues to move forward, they will be more cautious, but it will not stop completely or something like this. So again, as the picture shows, there may be gradual adaptation, but not a complete change of priorities.
Understand. Good to hear that, the possible softening of the stance of the Green Deal and taking into consideration the priorities of the EU's partners. Sorry, Agnes, would you like to weigh in? Agnes, would you like to weigh in?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of what we are seeing when it comes to economic trends, is very much in line with the kind of new priorities as well that have been mentioned by Antoine and Olaf. So in terms of medium-term trends, we do see increased investment in everything related with green energy, because we have these Green Deal framework in place in the EU. It won't go away. It might be specific kind of new pieces of legislation face opposition in Parliament, has been mentioned, but still there will be still quite a lot of legislation that has been passed, and we do have a framework that has attracted already like investment, and companies have been planned on the basis of that. And plus, I mean, the even far-right parties have internalized in a way that, in any case, the shift for security reasons towards greener energy is something that will remain there. We have seen that coming from Meloni and others. So this is definitely one of the big economic trend forwards. In terms of the second one, I would say still even investment when it comes to defense, in the sense that this will definitely be from what I've seen as well and read, one of the key priorities of the next Commission. There is still discussion, opposition towards this EU-level bonds emission to finance defense, but we might see some windows for opportunities probably earlier next year, depending on what Germany will decide to do in particular. But definitely the defense space will attract more kind of business opportunities in terms of money available there. In terms of the short-term outlook, I think it also goes back to the point that has been made in terms of competitiveness, attracting job as probably the third kind of next priority in terms of the EU. So the rebound from the pandemic in the EU has been much less stronger than in the US, has been slower. And we have seen some interesting trends that were not there before, like Southern European economies bouncing back much strongly than Germany and the core economy, which was a bit like very much not in line with what happened after the financial and Eurozone crisis, and with Germany always being the engine really of the EU economy, but now facing serious structural changes in terms of having had to rely too much on for cheap energy from Russia and from China in terms of trade. So in terms of what we are seeing in trends is really this core of Europe and Germany and all the interlinked supply chain really struggling. So it should improve, especially in the second half of the year. We're still in really strong growth from the US in particular, is boosting demand for European exports. We are seeing really strong export numbers in the first quarter for the first time. And in terms of GDP growth, in the first quarter of the year, after 5 consecutive quarters of stagnation in Europe, we have seen some positive growth numbers. So the short-term outlook, despite all this supply chain relocation and all the geopolitical risks that will definitely constrain growth over the medium term, the short-term outlook for Europe looks much brighter than what we expected 6 months ago. So we have been revising our forecast slightly up, especially considering this really strong growth number that we have seen in many countries in the first quarter, and on the back of declining inflation and still really strong wage growth in Europe, which is resulting in increased purchase power for consumers, and also the declining easing monetary policy by the ECB from June, which will help us especially next year to deliver a stronger rebound. So we will see this rebound happening even in Germany and the core of Europe, although this difference in terms of Southern and Eastern European Europe this year in particular performing better on the back of EU funds, the tourism sector, and really fiscal policy, which helped a lot and was not there after the Eurozone crisis and financial crisis. So this divergence compared to the historical trend is probably an interesting trend that we have observed. And also this de-risking from China benefiting for different sort of reasons, especially Eastern European countries and Southern European countries compared to the core of Europe.
Right. Sure. Olaf, please.
Sorry for again chiming in, but I didn't answer one of your remarks or questions about the possibilities of coalitions with the far right. Maybe two remarks on that. First of all, again, even if there still the core for most of the decision will still lie in the among the pro-European forces, but as we have seen throughout the last years already, and this is nothing new, on one decision or the other, there may be the votes may align elsewhere. So you will may have the ECR renew the EPP more or less aligning, others being a bit more split, and then you can have a majority outside of the outside of the Socialists and Greens. But again, this is not a formal coalition of any. It can happen by issue. I think we may see it in the trade area sometimes, but we have seen that before. So it would not be something completely new, as well as when it comes to economic issues. I think this is something to be worth to keep in mind. It doesn't mean that there is a coalition with the far right. Also, there is a tendency also in European media, I must say, to lump together every party that is right of the EPP, which is not true. You have a very different parties there, and in the I will very briefly just share again the presentation for a minute. So in this ECR group, you have a number of parties that are actually more conservative and have in the past even been part of the EPP group, or are kind of more or less moderate you can work with. A lot of them are not, but some of the members of the parliament are. And there is a bit of a mystery, of course, how the Fratelli d'Italia, the party of Giorgia Meloni, the Italian prime minister, will actually position itself. Because in her discourse, she kind of implies, and that we have seen in the European Council as well, she kind of implies she's there. I mean, she has a different vision, but she's there to somehow shape European policies in a more or less constructive manner. Again, you don't have to share that vision, but she has been much more constructive in her discourse. We will see whether the parliamentarians from her party will be like that, but this is still a bit of an open question. And there are very different, let's say, views on that yet, and I think we shall see. And then you have here the real far right that is not interested really to work constructively. It may happen that at some point you align with the votes, but so sometimes you have alignment with the communists on one issue or the other. And then you hear among these gray ones, you have some parties which are not yet decided and some which I would consider part of the hooligan far right, which has no interest, which are, I would say, if I may say so non-diplomatically, which are quite crazy and which even these far right don't want to have anything to do with. So this is a very diverse bunch. And therefore, you can't really say, I mean, there will be no coalition of the EPP with the far right, but there might be particularly with some of the members of the parliament of this group here, of the ECR, there might sometimes be a alignment on certain issues. That is certainly possible. But Antoine has a much better view on that and much more experience. So maybe he wants to weigh in as well.
If I may, thank you. I agree with all what's said. I would like to say two different things, two additional things, complementary. One, I think we have to be careful in Brussels and in the capitals to be complacent and to say, we just said, and it's true, in the machinery of the EU decision-making process in the next 5 years, these elections have not changed a lot because we keep a pro-European majority. That's very clear. But we should be careful not to be dismissive of the votes that have been expressed. And Olaf just mentioned that this is not, it's actually very marginally a complete anti-European vote. Many votes that have been expressed on that are not for the main traditional parties are not necessarily anti-European. They are arguing for maybe a different way of doing of building Europe, maybe a bit less regulated, maybe a bit more pro-business, maybe So I think this is something that if we are not careful in Europe and in Brussels and in the capitals, and if we believe that okay, these elections are gone and media were exaggerated and it's business as usual, I think it would be very dangerous for the future, because if we do that, then we've been doing that too much, I think, then the risk is that at the next elections, we will have more of these feelings. The second thing I would like to mention is the fact that, yes, the European elections are important, but they are only part of the equation of the decision-making process, because any law in Europe can only be decided if you have a majority of the European Parliament and the member state of the EU. What happened in these elections for the first time, I think, all countries are major in the EU, but a bigger country of the EU, France, the president has decided, looking at the result of the European election in his country, in France, to organize snap elections in a few weeks' time. This is a dramatic decision, and depending on the outcome of what will happen in my home country, in France, the result could be important for the decision-making process in the EU, because France is a founding member state of the EU, and if we have a big change of majority, it could have an impact on the whole process. So I think we should not forget that. And I must say that I witnessed 2 days ago discussing with one of the high-level leaders in Indonesia, and I was surprised that the only thing he discussed with me was that, the election in France, and what does it mean for the EU decision process and for the relationship between Europe and ASEAN. So let's be careful. The national level can have a big impact on, so the two are linked, right?
Absolutely. And I would love to get into that, but I don't know if we will have time to really break it down, because as I was talking to the panelists earlier today, to hear about the shifts, even, or the difference in how voters vote in the country, in each country. For example, in Germany, it's very different from the west, from the north, and how the youth are voting. So if we really want to get into that, I feel like there has to be like a 3-hour panel session. So I will not go into that. But Anton, you brought up a very, very good point, because I've only been hearing rosy things at this point, essentially debunking the pessimism that I've heard over the past couple of months. Yeah. So it's a bit understated. So actually, I want to go back to Agnes. I wanted to ask you, it seems like the short-term outlook for economics it's more optimistic, but is there anything in particular you think we should look out for in terms of the economic outlook for Europe? Any sort of potential hurdles that you predict?
Yes, the biggest risk probably from the geopolitics sides is, of course, the US elections, and this also the possibility of Trump raising a 10% import tariff that would definitely have a huge impact on our growth forecast, and especially in countries very export-oriented like Germany. So this is probably the key risk that clients are asking me about, like us, about all the time. And second risk, well, at the moment, I was also in Paris talking to clients up until the other day. And of course, there is a lot of uncertainty in terms of the France elections, but this is more kind of short-term risks in terms of financial markets volatility and fiscal outlook, what the EU will do in terms of implementing excess deficit procedures or things like that. But the more kind of risk that applies to the entire region is probably coming from still stronger domestic inflationary pressures coming from really strong growth wage. This might result to the ECB having to slow monetary policy a bit more gradually than what we currently expect. So we expect the ECB to cut interest rates further in September and December by 25 basis points. The Fed will probably start either in September or December, but especially if the Fed delays the first cut to December, and we are still seeing in terms of number, especially given that growth has been relatively surprising on the upside, if we are still seeing really strong wage growth in the second quarter, and inflation has actually picked up in Europe again in May. So if we don't see a clear kind of sign in terms of inflation declining, then the ECB might have to wait, and this, of course, has implication for growth because it means that the financing condition in the Eurozone will remain tighter for longer. It has implication in terms of, financing for households, for businesses. In any case, interest rates, they are not going to go back to the levels we saw before the pandemic. Like the zero interest rates word is gone, in the sense that given all the supply chain shifts, the aging population, all the issues that we are seeing in terms of labor market tightness, inflationary pressure will remain way more elevated than what we saw before the pandemic. And this means also that the central banks will have to keep interest rates at a higher level, even over the medium term. So yes, probably inflation and the Trump card, and on the short term, this like French election issue.
Okay. Thanks for that. I also wanted to touch another point that Antoine made. I think some of the voters are asking for things like for the EU to be a bit more pro-business. Is something that you agree with Antoine, and what sort of implications do you think the election results would have for the regulatory environment for businesses in Europe? I think this is something that our members would really like to hear about doing business in the EU.
Okay, is it for me or for Antoine? Sorry, I didn't get it.
For you or for Antoine? I think
okay.
for you,
yeah.
I think, yeah.
Okay. Yes, this is something that, has started already in terms of shift that we've seen in major EU member states, including France and Germany, before the elections, probably also in anticipation of, with this pre-electoral campaign, but we saw them calling to cut the red tapes in Europe. According to several surveys I've seen, companies are still flagging that as the first reasons that they consider while non-investing in Europe in terms of the FTI's kind of survey. So still regulation and red tape is still flagged as one of the key issues that is preventing kind of certain companies to invest more in the continent. And I think that this has clearly become kind of a concern even within more established EPP Renew parties like Macron, but even Scholz in general. So there is kind of broader consensus that there is something that needs to be done in terms of competitiveness and around kind of regulation and red tape. But then there are different views on how much you can play with diluting climate change related aspects of that, given the farmer protests. You have the far right and probably parts of the other groups that are also would like to dilute more and to give more like space to breathe to certain categories and firms and farmers in Europe, even when it comes to the environmental regulation. But more broadly, I think there is consensus around trying to make to cut red tapes in Europe. So this, I presume, will be part of all the discussion we will see in the next couple of months around competitiveness. We are waiting for the Draghi report around that. So capital market union, but there will be a lot of like plans to do something to make the continent more attractive to businesses. And this is important because if we are also at the same time using the tools available in terms of trade defense, like enhancing the EU screening, investment screening regulation in strategic sectors. So if you're doing that more, especially when it comes to investment from China, but other places on strategic sector, and we have seen the impact in terms of FDI flows declining in recent years, also because of that and other reasons as well. But if you do that at the same time, you still want to attract all other sort of investments. So they will be pushed to do something on the front too, essentially.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Agnes. I also want to stay a bit more on the economic side of things, but I think we have a question by Noel. Noel is asking about, the 51% turnout. Sorry to go back to the sort of voter turnout. Very marginally up on 2019. Is the citizens' participation in European Parliament elections sufficiently high to confer legitimacy on the results? Or does it highlight continuing voter disinterest? Excellent question, Noel. So I think maybe we can go to Olaf and then Antoine, please.
I think overall the turnout is rather a positive than a negative news. Yes, it could be higher, but it's also important to know that it varies a lot between certain member states. In Germany, it was above 60%. In some countries, it was above 80%. Well, partly because they have the obligatory turnout to vote, but still it has maintained, I would say, above 50% is for me the critical line, to be honest. And not to forget, I mean, you have a number of countries. I used to work in one quite a long time in Switzerland, where you have where the turnout is around 40 plus something percent. The midterm elections, if I'm not mistaken, for the House of Representatives in the US, is not necessarily higher. I would rather say a bit lower. So I mean, yes, it leaves something to desire. I think it's particularly problematic in countries which we still have, where it's below 30%, below 35%. Yeah, that's kind of a sad affair. But it's improving, and it shows rather for me that I see rather tendency that people actually get that these elections are important. I remember, I have not as much experience as Antoine, but I remember the elections for 2009, 2014, where I still had to explain to a lot of people why it is important to actually go to vote, and that it makes a difference which political group has how much votes. Now, this was my impression, this campaign, that was not really that necessary anymore. People, and this you saw already in the last elections, people actually got actually these are important elections, because imagine, I mean, these are very, from a governance level, they're quite far away. It's not national elections, it's European elections. The system is complicated. How the European Parliament works, that there is co-decision procedures where the member states play a role. This can be confusing. And with all that in mind, I think the 51%, of course, there is much room for improvement, but it's rather, I would say, continuous trend that people get that these elections, despite everything, are actually important.
Antoine, do you want to weigh in, or?
Yeah, I think this is why the European Parliament has been pleading for the last probably 25 years, and we will continue until we get what we want. We would like to have one electoral law in Europe, because we believe that these are European elections. We're electing members who are going to do the same job together in the next 5 years. And we believe that it would make more sense for the citizens of Europe to elect their members with the same electoral law than have 27 debate. But that's another topic. And thank you to Noel. I'm very happy to be in Jakarta since December to represent the European Parliament in the region. But the only bad thing is that I don't have to see Noel as much as before. So that's the only thing. On the question of, to go back to trade and relationship between Europe and Asia on the trade and econ issues, beyond the fact that what we just said, which is as much as we can predict today, and we'll see what happens, but as much as we can predict, there will be some kind of alignment, more alignment between the economic policies and of ASEAN and Europe when we speak about more growth and competitiveness and more about defense and security. I think clearly one of the big things for Europe in terms of this relationship with ASEAN, the ASEAN member states and the ASEAN itself in the next years will be completing the trade agreement that we've been negotiating with Indonesia for the last 7 or 8 years. There's a lot of fatigue and really an appetite on both sides to get to a decision. So and also we have now begun this year negotiation with the Philippines and with Thailand. So I think that if Europe wants to up its game with the region, this is definitely the thing to do, because if we manage to have 5 trade agreements, including those already approved with Singapore and Vietnam, we will have the right building blocks to maybe have a block-to-block agreement. So this is I would say the low-hanging fruit. Is still difficult. Any trade agreement negotiation is difficult, but I think the European Parliament is ready. They are following these negotiations very closely, and I think everybody has an appetite to finally close if we can find the right conditions to close. And the last point I want to make is that we talk a lot about changes or permanence in the EU, but one of the things that really bring Europeans together is their appetite for stability in the world, their appetite for improving universal rights, democracy, the rule of law, the multilateral order, which is very much in a bad place at the moment, especially with the war in Ukraine, the situation in the Middle East. And we see ASEAN as a great partner and a friend, not only on the economic issue, on trade issues, but also on defending this multilateral order, the territorial sovereignty. This for us is extremely important because there are not so many friends. I mean, there are some, but ASEAN is clearly in the Indo-Pacific region, which is so strategic today, our biggest ally, not only on economic trade, but on most geopolitical rule of law terms. So I think this is really important. I would be more than surprised if that would change in the next 5 years.
Agnes, I wanted to also go to you. Do you agree with this point of view? Because I think from what I've read, also there are concerns that the EU is going to be a bit more inward-looking. How do you think the EU is going to continue with its trade agreements with ASEAN, for example? Try and close it with Thailand and Philippines, and maybe restarting with Malaysia. Will the issues of environment, human rights, will it trump the sort of trade aspects of these FTAs, like what we are seeing in the current parliament?
Yeah, I do agree with what Antoine said, and I think that with the Asian countries in particular, there will be appetite in this context of de-risking from China to sign more preferential trade agreements. In terms of the opposition, like what the changes in the European Parliament, I think yes, trade deals are always controversial. So in certain cases, especially if they end up being a lot in the news and discussed at the national parliamentary level, that it might be tricky. So we have to remember that, yes, the parliament at the EU level has shifted towards the rights, and it is true that all preferential trade agreements is one of the areas where the European Parliament has most power because he has to agree. But the trade agreements have to be validated by national member states. And the kind of opposition that we have seen, especially like in places like France, has been like among the liberals as well. It's not like far-right parties opposing the deal. So especially with the EU-Mercosur, for instance, and that was done mostly on the basis of, as you said, environmental considerations. So there will still be opposition in certain member states, in particularly with the deals that have been most predominantly in the political discourse and the news, which kind of affects as well how much attention a trade deal gets in terms of the public opposition or not. But in a way, the fact that the green groups have now less power within the parliament, it also means that we might have a European Parliament less vocal about these specific issues when it comes to trade negotiation, and the far-right parties are way more relaxed in terms of negotiating kind of green standards for when it comes to, so it's kind of, it could deliver potentially a less opposed European Parliament on certain occasions. And probably thirdly, I would say that yes, theoretically, all kind of populist parties have protectionist tendencies, but then in practice, like we have seen when those come to power, like in places like Hungary or Meloni, and especially Hungary is interesting because, of course, Orban has interest in securing supply chains for his automotive sector, especially IVs. So if you look at the way they voted in terms of parliaments against these trade deals, is not like most of these populist parties haven't voted massively against those when it comes to the EU Parliament, and this applies to other populist parties too. So there are and there are also national interest considerations that will play when it comes to how these parties position themselves. And lastly, probably yes, when it comes to trade, so the parliaments at least at the EU level, but also national member states, they do have power when it comes to negotiating these preferential trade agreements, but then all other trade defense tool available that we have at the moment is mostly like within the remits of the European Commission, so there is not much that they can do about that.
Thank you. And Olaf, you wanted to weigh in as well.
Very quickly, and I very largely agree with what was said, but this is indeed the point. I would less see the European Parliament, despite all the noise, as the big obstacle for future trade agreements, but rather developments on national level. We see it also for Mercosur. I think if we had a vote for Mercosur in the European Parliament, I would be quite optimistic, but we know that several member states don't want it. And I think in the end, that these problems don't go away. We still have a number of national member states that are more skeptical on trade, particularly when it comes to agriculture. The national pressure is quite strong. But I also have the impression, when I talk also to people, that there is a general kind of uneasiness how few trade agreements were concluded in the past legislative period. So there is a certain sensibility, like we cannot do that again. We really have to move forward. So these pressures will not go away, but I think there is a certain awareness for the fact that this was not satisfactory how it was in the last 5 years. And for example, with Australia, it didn't go through. There is quite some, I think, awareness that on trade we have to be a bit more flexible on certain issues.
Great. I mean, these are all really great answers. Thanks so much, panelists. I'm very also conscious of the time because I know I promised to let all of you go in the next 15 minutes or so. I wanted to go, now that we're talking about international trade agreements, to also talk about the relationship between EU and ASEAN. Antoine, you earlier just briefly very touched on that. How do you view the election results that are impacting the EU's foreign policies and international relations, particularly with ASEAN? And my question actually is, how do you think ASEAN should prepare for this new EU? Is there anything particular that they need to look out for?
Well, first, I think, and it's very clear for all of us who live in the region here in Southeast Asia, that we need in Europe to make an effort to have more clear-eyed and to invest more in the relationship. We must do it, we must show it, we must be engaged. I always say my motto is engage, engage, and engage. We don't engage enough, and I really believe that with this region. You know, you have to realize that the Indo-Pacific strategy of the EU is a recent thing. It's only a few years. Takes time. The EU-ASEAN strategic partnership is also a very recent thing. So I think that if I hope that something is going to happen, and whatever the result of the European election, of the American election in November, whoever wins, it is clear, and we can see that with the issue of Ukraine. Europe must be more independent as much as it can. Europe must really take, more courage and must be more organized. So here, I must say, we don't see enough commissioners, we don't see enough members of the European Parliament, we don't see enough ministers. And I believe this is, and not me only, all the actors here, institutional actors, we believe an effort must be taken and must be made to show that this region is important for us. The Indo-Pacific now is 60% of the population. We have a huge interest also in, all the safety of the maritime corridors. This is strategic for us, and we can't just take it for granted. We need to work on it. So my advice would be more for us, the EU and the member state, to put our acts together and to make this relationship more substance. In terms of the ASEAN, I think we, if we manage together to get this trade agreement, that will be already a good, a solid, positive arguments in favor of a strong, and then we can build from there. I would begin with this trade agreement. I think they would bring go a long way in, and I think that again, this question of the fact that we are allies, we are friends on all these big multinational issues, rule order. It used to be normal to agree on that. It has become quite unusual. It has become difficult to fight for. When we're talking about trade agreements, I remember the good old days of WTO. Where is WTO? Where is the appetite for global negotiations? It would be much better to have a serious global negotiation than very difficult bilateral or regional trade agreements. So let's try together, ASEAN and Europe, to build not only our own relationship, but also to be part of putting the world a bit back in order, if I may say, and maybe fight for this international rules-based order that I think the whole world dramatically needs. So if we can play our part in that, I think we will have done a good job in the next 5 years.
Okay, Olaf, I thought you wanted to raise something. Yes, please, Agnes.
No,
No?
that's
Okay.
okay. I mean, I do agree with Antoine and Olaf on the aspects of going towards still more protectionist word, and especially in terms of like national parliaments, EU member states, head of states. So yes, this is a trend that we should take into kind of consideration. But it doesn't mean then that, and it is true that we haven't had much success recently, and some disappointments around like some EU kind of Australia and other trade agreements, but there will be still some pressure to finalize some, especially as China is also a competitor in markets like Latin America and others. And we have already missed our chance in several places in Africa, for instance, where China arrived first. And so there will be still some economic security consideration to add into the equation. And given that ASEAN overall, in terms of the business environment and even in terms of rule of law, fares much better than other places, and probably they will see less opposition that in for different type of trade deals. So you always have some also technical things. I mean, I'm not a trade expert, but I know that certain deals have been negotiating by dividing certain aspects, so to get some like components approved more quickly than others. So there is also some technicalities that you can do to get a deal through kind of the line as well.
Well, I guess us at the Business Council and European businesses in Southeast Asia would certainly like to see more EU involvement in this part of the world. I think it's very, very important, especially as someone who attends, all these different ASEAN regional meetings, and we don't really see sort of EU involvement. It's unfortunate because I think some of the key dates are they overlap, but certainly that would really, really help businesses in this part of the world. Olaf, you wanted to say something?
Yes, very briefly, but this is exactly the part of also of our work as a political foundation. We have a number of offices in the region. We regularly get, and I'm very grateful to Antoine, who for years or rather decades almost has received these groups. We regularly actually bring groups. Sometimes it's young politicians, sometimes it's economic experts, very different groups here to Brussels to exactly pierce the bubble of belly button watching that you can sometimes have when it comes to the region. So we try to do that very strongly as foundation. And just a glimmer of hope, my impression is, Antoine may correct me, but that Brussels is waking up to a certain extent, or at least partly to that. There is a bigger perception for the importance to increase presence, increase relations with ASEAN. I completely agree with Antoine. We need to be more present on the ground. If we have an Indo-Pacific forum, we need to send the first line and not the representative of the representative of the representative to these fora. So yes, we should do more, but I see rather a positive trend in that area.
And I would like to concur 100%. I also wanted to ask, beyond ASEAN, what do you think the EU's global role will be and its relationship with other key international partners like the US, China, Russia, for example? Maybe just that one question, and then after that, I wanted to maybe engage in a little bit in crystal ball gazing and ask you about the top job for the EU, President Ursula von der Leyen's fate. So maybe we can go first into that sort of EU's, relationship with other partners outside of ASEAN, and then we'll go to that last question. This is to all
Well, if
of
I
you.
may on that, yeah, if I may on that, I think that Europe has one advantage is what you see is what you get. So we don't, our agenda is very clear. we have been born because of we didn't want wars anymore. So we are born. Our DNA is follow the rules-based order because we were victims of not doing that for many decades. Our DNA is to support multilateral order, rules in the world, continue on the lines. It can be reformed, of course. The world changed a lot since World War II. I think we should take into account the new balances, the new equilibrium of the world. But basically, we are in favor of return to a certain international dialogue, and I think that this is really what the partners in the world, all our partners in the world, recognize in Europe. What you see is what you get. You know what you get with Europe. The people know what we want, and we're not changing. And this election, again, on these fundamentals, will not change anything. What you see is continues to be what you get, right? So let's try and rebuild this international order. Let's try to take into account more the new balances of this world. I mean, certainly the Indo-Pacific region was not as present as it is today when we created all these UN and other. So certainly some major changes should happen. But the today's situation where we don't talk anymore and where there is a lot of the world that instead of being globalized has become a place of confrontation. This is not where Europe wants to be, and we are pleading in the reverse action.
No, Agnes, first you.
Okay. No, very quickly in terms of other relations, maybe in the trends. Definitely, we have seen alignment with Biden of EU-US relations and stance, particularly towards China to a certain extent, and this will continue. Probably the US-EU relations is the trickiest one because it much will depend of the election results, but probably the only thing when we will see an alignment, both if Trump or Biden wins, is this anti-EU China policy that will continue, and in Europe as well, although to a different extent because of the economic interlinkage, but at least from a EU policy perspective and from what we expect the European Commission to do in terms of using trade tools, that will definitely be a priority, kind of competing in terms of ensuring fairer competition for EU businesses towards when it comes to China. And probably other areas areas to watch besides the kind of Asian economies in this context of de-risking would definitely be neighboring countries. When it comes to energy security, lots of deal with both Caucasus, Central Asian, and both North and African countries and others. So definitely more kind of focus in terms of pragmatic approach with different kind of issues, both migration, but also energy security when it comes to the neighborhood of Europe.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would say that, for example, the elections. One interesting interpretation I received from a Latin American correspondent I talked to is, oh, this is an election against the EU's course in Ukraine. No, it's not. The result, I would say, on Ukraine and Russia, the EU will hold course. There will be still strong support, especially in the European Parliament, of the EU as such. It will be difficult, of course, with the very different stances sometimes of member states, particularly Hungary and Slovakia, to get a common understanding on this or that issue. But the strong support will be maintained. I think on China there will be it still will be reflected by the very different positions of member states, of course. But I think the general trend is indeed to not cut off, not to let's say to decouple. Of course, this will be impossible for at least for the time being for Europe to do. To a certain degree, de-risk, yes, although there has to be still a common understanding on particular issues what de-risking means. But sometimes I think to be a tad less naive, of course, when it comes to China. I think you have seen it on electric vehicles. This was, I think, quite a strong signal to basically tell, look, we are very happy to compete on an eye level, on a level playing field, but we're not gonna let slide if we have the impression that the other competitor is being doped all the time, is receiving massive doping, and we are too naive on some issues. So I think the perception of naivety in key sectors, not yet in the European Commission necessarily, which is still kind of a bulwark of let's play very strictly by the rules, even if others don't. But I think among member states there are increasing apprehension. I think also many voices in the European Parliament say we need to be a bit smarter on these issues. So the EU will remain very loyal to multilateral solution. It will continue to support multilateral fora. It has no interest of that the world is falling apart into separate entities that don't talk to each other. It's not in the EU's interest. But I think there will be a little less naivety on let's say uncompetitive or let's say breaching of competitiveness rules or unfair competition. So I think on that the EU will likely be a bit tougher, but again, this will be always a process because you still have quite different stances of member states.
Thank you very much. I think that was really, really interesting insights on all of you. It has been such a pleasure to speak to all of you and to sort of unpack what the EU elections mean, sort of debunk the myths or the pessimism that we've been seeing. Also very, very good to hear about the economic implications of the EU elections. So I really appreciate you to come on today. But I have one very, very last question, and I think that's on the minds of a lot of people. Will Ursula von der Leyen take the top job for the second term, you think?
My bet is that what was not agreed this week will be agreed next week.
Okay.
So I guess the trio, the quatuor that was on the table, I believe will be, it's my bet, my personal bet. Okay, not as an official capacity, I can't say that. On a personal level, my bet is that it will go through next week.
I agree with Antoine. Then the European Parliament vote is that will be a bit of struggling. That is true, but the chances for von der Leyen to be Commission President are much better now than they used to be a few weeks before the European elections. So, and from the European Council, I basically expect more or less a validation of the personal portfolio that we have seen. Von der Leyen Commission President, Costa, because she apparently also gets well along with him, which would be a big relief after the current Council President, maybe the President of the European Council. And I'm a bit less sure about that, but I would still say that probably the High Representative will be Kaja Kallas from Estonia, a liberal, and Metsola quite likely, I think, but Antoine can say that better, the President of the European
The
Parliament.
members will decide. The members will decide.
Yes, the members will decide, of course, but
Right.
I think she has relatively good chances, but that
Yeah.
we see a bit later than next week. That's true.
Well, I think Olaf, you and I share the same outlook. Ines, maybe your input.
Yeah, this is broadly in line with what I had in terms of my forecast as well, and also probably Kallas the less secure among the names because of her kind of tough stances, and especially her position on the EU defense Eurobond as well. Probably Germany the less keen to have her, but still a strong candidate. Then the question is what will be given to Italy, but then it's a different question. But I still, I've seen that, Letta just resigned from Sciences Po in Paris this morning. I don't know whether there will be something for him as well. But given that we have mentioned kind of, Germany, Spain, like and others, then the question is also what the other big member states will guess. And of course, I've been asked about the head of the ECB as well, but as we know, we want to have it's an 8 years mandate, so it's not Lagarde will stay until 2027, I believe. So yeah.
Okay, fantastic. We'll see if all of our bets were on point, and if you put money somewhere, good luck to you. But otherwise, thank you very much. I don't want to hold anybody back. As promised, right before 11:15, we're ending this webinar. Thank you so much for joining us, our panelists, and for those in Asia, again, thank you for spending your Friday evening with us. Have a good weekend ahead, everyone. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. You have the names of the panelists as well on our social media platforms. You may want to reach out to them or follow them on LinkedIn on their social media as well. So otherwise, have a good weekend, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take
Bye.
care.
Bye-bye. Thank you,
everybody.
Liana.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Olaf.